"I'm sorry, sweetheart, but are you quite sure you're in the right section?" The words landed softly, almost kindly, the way a blade sometimes does before you feel it. And Zara Williams stood in the aisle of Apex Airlines Flight 412, with her boarding pass in one hand and her carry-on handle in the other. And she understood immediately, with the particular clarity of a girl who had been understanding things like this since she was old enough to walk into rooms where people expected her to turn around and walk back out, that the question had nothing to do with her seat assignment. She was 17 years old. She was wearing a navy blazer over a white blouse and tailored slacks. She had ironed herself at 11 o'clock the previous night. Her carry-on was a clean black roller bag, not oversized, positioned neatly at her side. Her boarding pass, Apex Airlines Flight 412, Atlanta to Boston. Seat 3A, first class, was printed in clear black text, and it had already been scanned green at the gate 14 minutes ago by a woman who had smiled at her and said, "Enjoy your flight." None of that mattered to Diane Holloway. Diane was standing at the entrance to the first-class cabin with the practiced stillness of a woman who had spent 20 years learning how to occupy a doorway in a way that felt like a wall, and she had platinum blonde hair pulled back beneath her service cap so tightly it gave her face a stretched, severe look that her smile, always present, always slightly wrong, could not quite soften. Her name tag caught the overhead light. Her eyes moved over Zara the way eyes move over something that doesn't belong in a frame. "My seat is 3A, Zara said, and her voice was even not loud, not defensive, simply factual in the way that people are factual when they have nothing to prove. Diane's smile didn't widen or shrink. It simply held the way a held breath holds. She took the boarding pass from Zara's hand with 2 fingers and examined it with the slow, deliberate thoroughness of a customs officer inspecting a document she already suspects is forged, turning it over, holding it briefly toward the overhead light as though checking for a watermark, and several passengers already seated in first class glanced up from their phones and their newspapers and their pre-departure champagnes to watch, and then looked away, and then looked back again, because something in the quality of the silence was impossible to ignore. A businessman in 4B looked up from his laptop. A woman in 1A caught the eye of the woman beside her. In seat 2, B, a silver-haired woman with the quiet, unhurried posture of someone who had spent decades in rooms where everyone else was performing, and she was simply watching. She set her book face down on her knee very carefully and did not look away. Diane handed the boarding pass back. "First class is to the left," she said, as if Zara had not already known this, as if the knowledge needed to be granted rather than confirmed. And then she turned to the businessman behind Zara in the boarding line, a white man in his 50s with a leather briefcase, and her smile transformed genuine and warm into something completely different. "Mr. Patterson, welcome back. We have your usual seat ready." Zara walked to 3A. She placed her carry-on in the overhead compartment with the same care and economy of movement she brought to everything, then sat down and adjusted the seatbelt across her lap and turned to look out the window at the tarmac below, at the ground crew moving in their orange vests, at the luggage carts tracking slow lines across the gray concrete. And she breathed once, slowly, the way her mother had taught her to breathe when something was trying to get inside her and she couldn't afford to let it. She did not allow her expression to change. Across the aisle in 2B, the silver-haired woman turned her book face up again and resumed reading, though her eyes behind her glasses had not moved down to the page. Behind Zara, in the row, just entering the first-class section, a man in a well-cut charcoal suit paused at his seat, 4A, and opened his briefcase on the fold-down tray with the systematic patience of someone who was settling in for the long game rather than the short one. He took out a yellow legal pad and a pen. He didn't look at Zara directly, but he had been watching since the boarding door. What no one on that plane could have known yet, what Diane Holloway would spend the remaining years of her career trying to forget, was that the girl in seat 3A had already pressed record. The alarm on Zara Williams's phone went off at 4:47 a.m. though she had been awake since 4, lying on her back in the dark with her hands folded over her chest like she was rehearsing something which in a way she was running through the opening of her Harvard interview response for the 11th time in her head, adjusting the phrasing, sharpening the second sentence because the second sentence was the one that either held a room or lost it, and she was not willing to lose it. Her bedroom on the 3rd floor of her family's apartment in Chicago's South Side was the kind of room that told you everything about a person if you knew how to look. Not the kind that announced itself with posters and collections and curated personality, but the quieter kind with a desk lamp that had been the same desk lamp since she was 11 years old. A cracked spine on nearly every book on the shelf because she read them rather than displayed them. A debate trophy on the corner of the dresser with a hairline fracture running through the base where she had dropped it in 8th grade and then superglued it back together and kept it anyway, not out of sentiment exactly, but because she believed in finishing things you started. On the back of her door, hung with a single hook at the collar so the fabric wouldn't crease, was the navy blazer and white blouse she had laid out the night before, and beside them on the chair, the tailored slacks she had found at a second-hand shop on 51st Street for $14 and had taken to a woman 3 blocks away who hemmed them perfectly for 8 more. And the total cost of the outfit she was going to wear to Harvard University was $22, and the kind of care that money cannot purchase. Zara had been saving for this trip for 14 months. 2 after-school jobs tutoring 9th graders in algebra at the community center on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, and working the Saturday morning shift at a bakery on Cottage Grove where she got there at 6 a.m. and didn't leave until one had accumulated over 14 months of discipline so consistent it had stopped feeling like discipline and started feeling simply like her life enough to cover a round-trip economy ticket to Boston and one night in a budget hotel near campus. Those had been her plans. Her mother had other ideas. Doctor. Nadine Williams had come into Zara's room the previous evening, not late, not dramatically. Just knocked once and opened the door and sat on the edge of the bed, the way she did when she had something to say that wasn't a conversation so much as a transfer of something important, and she had held out a printed boarding pass, and Zara had looked at it, and then looked at her mother and said nothing for a moment, because the pass said first class in the upper right corner, and Zara didn't understand. "You've been ironing that blazer for 2 months," her mother said simply. "The flight should match the blazer." Dr. Nadine Williams was not a woman who explained herself twice. She was 44 years old, with the same deep brown skin as her daughter, and the same quality of stillness in the face, though on Nadine it came not from youth, but from 20 years of courtrooms and depositions and congressional briefings, 20 years of being the person in the room who spoke last and least, and carried the most weight when she did. She was, as of 8 months ago, the acting head of the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, a fact that appeared nowhere on her LinkedIn profile because she had not updated it in 3 years and did not intend to. She kissed Zara on the forehead, told her to sleep, and left for a red-eye to Washington for an early briefing that couldn't be moved. She would not be on the flight to Boston. Zara lay in bed for a while after her mother left and held the boarding pass above her face in the dark and read the words, "First class," several more times, and something moved through her that she couldn't quite name. Not excitement exactly, and not nervousness exactly, but a kind of weight that came with knowing that a thing you had worked for had been seen by someone who loved you, and that they had decided to mark it. She ironed the blazer at 11 p.m. At the airport the next morning, she moved through security with the practiced efficiency of someone who traveled infrequently enough that every step still required deliberate thought, shoes off, laptop out, carry-on, positioned just so on the belt, and came out the other side and followed the gate signs through Terminal B with her portfolio tucked under her arm, the portfolio that held printed copies of her Harvard application essays, her community initiative materials, her 3 letters of recommendation, and the 8-page document she had prepared, summarizing the outcomes of the food desert project she had been running for 3 years in partnership with 2 Chicago nonprofits. A project that had delivered fresh produce to 11 neighborhoods where the nearest grocery store was more than a mile away, and the nearest fast food restaurant was less than a block. A project that had started because she had been 13 years old and angry and had decided to turn the anger into a spreadsheet and then a grant application and then something real. At the gate, the agent scanned her boarding pass and the light turned green, and the woman looked up at her with a genuine smile and said, "Enjoy your flight to Boston, Miss Williams." Zara stepped onto the jet bridge, thinking that the future felt like it was already beginning, and she was ready for it, and nothing about the next few hours was going to change that. She did not know yet about Diane Holloway, though in a way, in the small, silent, particular way that Zara Williams noticed things she had already begun to. Because when she stepped through the aircraft door and turned left into the first-class cabin, she saw Diane's expression flicker just for a fraction of a second there and gone before most people would have caught it. And she recognized it the way you recognize a word in a foreign language. You've been hearing your whole life without being formally taught a micro-compression of the jaw, a slight narrowing at the corners of the eyes. The expression of someone encountering something they did not expect and did not welcome. Zara filed it away. She had a habit of filing things. The first-class cabin of Flight 412 held 16 passengers that morning, and Diane Holloway knew 14 of them by name. This was not unusual. Diane had worked the Atlanta to Boston route for 6 years, and the business travelers who flew it regularly had become familiar to her in the way that regulars become familiar, not exactly friends, but known quantities, comfortable presences, people whose preferences she had memorized, the way a good server memorizes a table's order before they ask. Mr. Patterson in 4B liked an aisle seat and a double espresso before takeoff. The woman in 1A, a corporate attorney named Rebecca Foss, always requested the vegetarian option, even though it wasn't listed because Diane had noted it once and arranged it thereafter. The elderly gentleman in 3B traveled with his own pillow, which he tucked against the window, and Diane had once quietly upgraded his row companion to another seat when the original occupant had been a fidgeter. She was, by every metric Apex Airlines used to evaluate its senior flight crew, exceptional. She did not greet Zara Williams, not when Zara settled into seat 3A, not when Diane moved through the cabin offering pre-departure beverages, sparkling water, orange juice, champagne, and paused at every row except the one containing a 17-year-old black girl in a navy blazer. Not when she circled back and attended to the businessman who had boarded after Zara and was already comfortable with his champagne flute, and not when she leaned across to the woman in 2A with a warm question about her connection in Boston. Zara raised her hand. Not urgently, not with frustration, just a small, clear, upward gesture that anyone scanning the cabin would have seen in an instant the universal signal for when you have a moment. Diane walked past. Then passed again 3 minutes later, chatting quietly with Mr. Patterson about his upcoming conference in Cambridge. Zara put her hand down. In 2B, the silver-haired woman who had given her name to no one on this flight and would not give it until it became necessary, turned a page in her book and did not turn her head, though the quality of her attention had shifted in a way that anyone who had spent time in courtrooms would have recognized as the shift from passive observation to active documentation. Behind Zara, in 4A, James Okafor, 41 years old, partner at a civil rights law firm with offices in Chicago and Atlanta, on his way to a conference at Boston College School of Law, clicked his pen open and made his first note on his legal pad. He didn't write anything inflammatory. He simply wrote the time, 7:14 a.m. pre-departure beverage service. Row 3, A not approached. The second incident was the boarding pass. It happened as the final passengers were still boarding, Diane making her way through the cabin, conducting the mandatory pre-departure check, verifying that seatbelts were accessible and carry-on bags properly stowed. A routine so practiced it moved at the speed of habit. She moved efficiently down the rows, one brief visual sweep per seat. No interruptions until she reached row 3 and stopped and looked at Zara's boarding pass, which was sitting on the tray table exactly where it had been sitting since Zara placed it there and picked it up. "I'll need to verify this again," Diane said. and her tone was the professionally neutral tone of someone performing a required task which would have been entirely convincing, except for the fact that she had not verified a single other boarding pass in the cabin, including the pass belonging to a teenage white boy in row 5 who was 3 years younger than Zara and had not been asked to confirm anything. Zara watched Diane examine the pass for the second time in 20 minutes. The same thorough, slow inspection, the same tilting toward the light without changing her expression. "It was scanned green at the gate," Zara said. Diane replied, which was not an acknowledgement and not a disagreement and not anything really, just a sound that took up space where a response should have been, and she set the pass back on the tray with a small, precise motion and moved on. From the galley doorway, Nina Park watched. Nina was 24 years old, 7 months into her first assignment with Apex Airlines, still in the phase of her career where she noticed things she hadn't yet learned to file as unremarkable. And what she had noticed in the past 15 minutes was a pattern she recognized from somewhere she couldn't immediately name, and so, while Diane was forward in the cabin, she moved quietly to the crew tablet mounted near the galley entrance and pulled up the passenger manifest for row 3. The flag was there immediately, a small red indicator she had never seen on a domestic flight before, a classification she had only read about in the crew manual during training Special Services Alpha level. "Do not disturb. Contact Williams Foundation Internal Security upon request." Nina looked at it for a moment, then looked at Diane's back, then reached for the crew phone mounted beside the tablet to call the operations desk because an Alpha flag meant something significant, and she wanted to understand what she was looking at before this flight left the gate. Diane's voice came from just behind her left shoulder, very close and very low. "Put the phone down." Nina turned around. Diane was standing in the galley doorway with her arms folded and the specific expression of someone who has decided that a conversation is going to go a particular way regardless of how it starts. "She's flagged." "Alpha." Nina said carefully. "I just wanted to—" "I've reviewed the manifest," Diane said, and her voice had the flat, load-bearing quality of a statement that is not an explanation but a conclusion. "I've assessed the situation. You've been on this route for 7 months. She paused just long enough for the arithmetic to land. "Do you want to call the operations desk and explain to them why you're second-guessing your senior attendant's assessment of a passenger? She's already evaluated, or do you want to go prep the beverage cart?" Nina held the phone for 1 more second. Then she set it back in its cradle. Diane was already moving back toward the cabin. Nina stood in the galley alone for a moment, looking at the manifest. She looked at the Alpha flag. She looked at Diane through the galley doorway, where she was now rearranging something on the service cart with the efficient calm of someone who had resolved a situation to her satisfaction. Nina pulled out her personal phone, which was against regulations during pre-departure, and typed a single note into her notes app, 7:19 a.m., Alpha flag, row 3, D-blocked call to ops. She didn't know yet why she was writing it down. She was glad later that she had. The water spill happened 6 minutes before takeoff. The seatbelt signs had illuminated, and Diane was moving through first class performing the final pre-departure check tray tables, up seat backs forward. Carry-ons secured, and she arrived at row 3 and told Zara that her portfolio needed to be stowed, which was accurate. And Zara began carefully gathering the papers she had spread across the tray, reaching for the edge of the Harvard preparation folder. And Diane was standing closer than the geometry of the task required with a water pitcher that she was ostensibly returning from a service run. And then there was a sudden tilt, graceful and practiced and almost entirely invisible as an intentional act, and the water poured across the tray table in a clean, wide arc and soaked the papers beneath Zara's hands. "Oh," Diane said, and the sound carried exactly the right amount of concern, not too much, not too little, calibrated to sound like an accident to anyone listening who wasn't paying close attention. "I'm so sorry about that." Zara's printed interview notes the 8 pages she had spent 4 hours assembling, the ones with the specific statistics about her food desert initiative. The quote from the nonprofit director she had been going to reference, the careful language she had constructed to answer the expected question about why Harvard specifically were wet through the ink beginning to run at the edges. Her hands stilled over the pages. Diane leaned in, voice dropping just enough to be private. "These seats are usually for our regulars who know the drill." She straightened up. "Let me get you some napkins." The napkins she returned with were cocktail-sized, decorative, barely absorbent. Zara looked at the ruined papers for exactly 1 second. Then she began blotting them carefully and methodically, salvaging what she could, and when the napkins were saturated, she folded them and set them to the side and continued working through the pages with the same calm deliberateness with which she did everything. And if something moved behind her eyes, it moved quickly and privately, and was gone before it could be named. She put the papers back in the portfolio. She reached into her bag. She took out her phone. She angled it against the tray table rest, not obviously, not with any gesture that announced itself, and she pressed record, and she set it so the lens had a clear line of sight to the aisle, and she looked out the window at the tarmac and the morning sky. In seat 4, a James Okafor made a second note, 7:31 a.m., liquid spill. Appeared deliberate. Passenger documents damaged. Recording confirmed active. He had been watching Zara's hands since the moment Diane walked away. He opened a new page on his legal pad and began to write more quickly. They reached cruising altitude at 31,000 feet at approximately 8:05 a.m. The seatbelt signs chiming off the cabin settling into the particular rhythm of a long-haul first-class flight. Laptops opening eye masks, appearing the soft percussion of ice being placed into glasses, and Diane Holloway moved through the aisle with the meal service cart with the grace and efficiency that 20 years of practice produces, stopping at each row with a warm, practiced presentation, lifting tray covers, confirming selections, addressing passengers by name when she knew them and by a generic friendly warmth when she didn't, and the aroma of the hot chicken option. The one that the cabin had been told was the signature choice for this route moved through the first-class section like a small, luxurious announcement. She stopped at row 2. She stopped at row 4. She stopped at rows 5 and 6 and worked her way forward to row 1. She did not stop at row 3. Zara waited. She had learned somewhere in the preceding hour that waiting had a specific quality in this situation. Not passive, not resigned, but attentive. The kind of waiting that accumulates rather than simply passes. And so she waited with her hands folded on the tray table and her phone still recording at its quiet angle, and the very particular quality of stillness that comes from a person who has decided that her behavior in this moment is going to be the most documented thing in this cabin. She pressed the call button. The small overhead light blinked on a warm orange glow visible to anyone in the aisle, and 3 minutes passed before Diane appeared at the end of the row, not hurrying, not particularly acknowledging the light as urgent. "Yes," she said. "Not yes, miss? Not yes. How can I help you? Just yes stripped of everything that turns a word into a courtesy." "I haven't received my meal," Zara said, keeping her voice level and quiet and perfectly carefully polite in the way that requires more effort than the alternative. "I'm so sorry," Diane said, and the apology had the texture of a performance complete in form, empty of content. "I'm afraid we've run out of the chicken option you selected." "That's completely fine," Zara said. "I'm happy with any of the alternatives. We're actually quite low across the board in first class this morning," Diane said, and her expression was professionally sympathetic in a way that did not reach anything behind the expression. "I can bring you something from the economy service if you'd like. It's quite comparable." "That would be fine," Zara said. "Thank you." She watched Diane move back toward the galley. She watched through the gap between the seats in front of her, the meal cart stationary in the aisle at row 2, which was empty of passengers at the moment, both seats unoccupied, and she watched Diane rearrange 2 trays on the cart and then move the cart forward, and with the systematic certainty of someone who has made a decision and is now simply executing it, deliver a hot chicken meal to the white businessman, 3 rows ahead of Zara, who had told her at the start of service that the chicken was his first choice. The steam rising from the plate caught the cabin light. Zara looked at it for exactly 1 moment. Then she looked at the screen of her phone, which was still recording, and adjusted the angle by 3 degrees so that the gap between the seats and the meal now sitting on the businessman's tray was in frame. She took a breath that was completely invisible from the outside and looked back out the window. Across the aisle, Judge Evelyn Cross, who had still not introduced herself to anyone and who had turned the same page of her book 3 times in the past 40 minutes, set the book down on her knee and looked at the window herself for a moment, and the expression on her face was the expression of a person who has seen a thing confirmed that they suspected, and who has, as a consequence, quietly reclassified the situation from concerning to actionable. In 4. A. Okafor made his 3rd note, 8:17 a.m. meal service. Row 3 skipped. Passenger told chicken unavailable. Chicken delivered to 6A 4 minutes later. Photographed. He looked at his notes, then put his pen down, then picked it up again and circled the word photographed. The intercom chimed at 8:43 a.m. with the 2-tone sound that preceded a cabin crew announcement rather than a captain's message, and the cabin, which had settled into its cruising quietude, shifted slightly toward attention. The small collective readjustment of people pausing what they're doing to register whether the announcement concerns them. Diane's voice came through the speakers with the measured professional clarity that 20 years of training produces, and she said, "Ladies and gentlemen, just a brief reminder that our first-class cabin is reserved for our ticketed first-class passengers this morning, and we ask that any companions traveling in economy please remain in their assigned sections. Thank you so much for your understanding." The cabin went quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. The businessman in 4B looked up from his laptop and looked around the first-class section with genuine confusion, because every person visible to him was seated seatbelted and clearly in a first-class seat, and there were no companions from economy standing in the aisle, and there was nothing about the configuration of the cabin that the announcement could possibly be responding to except for one thing, and he understood what the one thing was, and his expression moved through confusion and into discomfort and then into a neutral blankness that was itself a kind of statement. The woman in 1A. Rebecca Foss took off her reading glasses and looked at the back of Diane's head where she stood near the galley curtain, and her expression was more direct than the businessman's, something sharper in it, less comfortable with the neutral blankness. In 2B, Judge Evelyn Cross folded her reading glasses into their case with a small, deliberate click and set the case on the tray table, and looked at Diane with the expression that she had worn for 30 years when a witness had just said something under oath that they should not have said. Zara was looking out the window. She had heard the announcement, of course everyone in the cabin had heard it, and she had felt the particular quality of it move through her like the specific cold of something that is meant to be felt but not acknowledged. The kind of cruelty that comes dressed in generic language, so that the target has no clean way to point at it and say that was aimed at me without being told they're imagining things. She did not turn away from the window. Judge Cross turned toward the galley and raised her voice by exactly enough to be heard clearly by everyone in the first-class cabin without raising it in any way that could be described as shouting. "Excuse me." Her voice had the texture of someone who had called enough courtrooms to order to have the frequency exactly right. "That announcement, could you clarify what prompted it? I don't see anyone in this cabin who isn't in their assigned first-class seat." Diane came forward from the galley curtain with a professional smile that had the specific tightness of a smile being held in place by effort rather than feeling. "Just a routine reminder, ma'am." "A routine reminder," Cross repeated, and the repetition was not agreement. It was the technique of a cross-examiner, letting a statement stand in the open air so everyone present could examine it at their own pace. "I've flown first class on this route 11 times in the past 2 years, and I've never heard that announcement. What specifically prompted it this morning?" "Passenger conduct protocols," Diane said, and the phrase was smooth and practiced, and entirely empty of specific content, a phrase designed to sound official while committing to nothing. "I see," Cross said, and her tone was the tone of someone who sees considerably more than the response has offered. and which passenger's conduct specifically prompted the protocol, Diane's smile tightened further. She turned toward Zara's row. "This passenger has been creating difficulties since boarding, and I'd ask her to—" "I haven't said a word above a whisper since I boarded," Zara said from the window, still not turning her head, her voice calm and clear and not particularly directed at anyone. It was simply quietly true. The businessman in 4B looked at his laptop and then looked at the back of Zara's seat and then closed his laptop. From the row behind Zara, James Okafor's voice came forward quiet, even carrying the specific weight of a man who has spent considerable time choosing words for maximum precision. "You'll want to be careful about that word," he said. "Difficulties." Diane looked at him. "Sir, this is a conversation I'm following closely," Okafor said, not aggressively, just as a statement of fact. Diane looked at Cross, who had turned back to the window with the unhurried patience of someone who has already seen enough. In the galley, Nina Park stood very still with her personal phone in her hand, her thumb hovering over the Notes app she had opened at 7:19 a.m., and she typed 8:43 a.m. intercom announcement, "No cause visible," directed at 3A. She looked through the galley curtain at Diane's back. Then she looked at the manifest on the crew tablet at the Alpha flag at the name Williams Zara. "Don't disturb. Williams Foundation Internal Security." She thought about what Diane had said to her before takeoff 7 months. "Do you want to explain yourself to operations?" And she thought about it carefully. And then she put her phone back in her pocket and went to make beverage preparations for the descent service. And while she did, she made a private decision that had nothing to do with Diane and everything to do with a girl in seat 3A who had been sitting in perfect quiet, documented silence for the past hour and a half. 2 hours into the flight at cruising altitude somewhere over Connecticut, Zara Williams stood up. It was not a dramatic or sudden movement. She unbuckled her seatbelt with the same quiet care with which she did everything, smoothed the front of her blazer, picked up her small personal bag from beneath the seat, and began walking toward the forward lavatory, the one that was 4 rows ahead of her, the one that was closest to her seat, and that she was, as a first-class passenger, entirely entitled to use. She had been in her seat for 2 hours and 11 minutes. Diane Holloway appeared from the galley as if she had been waiting for exactly this. She stepped into the aisle 3 rows ahead of Zara and stood with a particular quality of stillness that transformed the aisle from a passageway into a barrier. And she said in the same level, professional tone she had used for every previous interaction, "Economy restrooms are toward the rear of the aircraft." Zara stopped walking. She looked at Diane's face. "I'm in first class," she said. "This is the closest restroom." "I understand," Diane said, "but the first-class lavatory is reserved for our premium cabin passengers during service hours and with the meal cart still." "I am a premium cabin passenger," Zara said, and her voice was still even, still precise, still carrying no heat, only the clean, factual weight of a statement that required no elaboration. "Seat 3A, first class. I have been in that seat for 2 hours. The businessman in 4B had stopped pretending to look at his laptop. The woman in row 5 had her phone out at an angle that was not quite casual. In 2B, Judge Cross watched with the complete unmoving attention of someone who has decided to remember this. And then Diane Holloway made the mistake that would follow her for the rest of her life. It came out louder than she intended, or perhaps exactly as loud as she intended, some part of her having decided in the accumulated pressure of this flight and this passenger, who had not responded to any of it the way Diane had needed her to respond, that the performance of authority was no longer sufficient, and the real thing was required. And so she said, "Know your place. People like you don't belong up here." The words hung in the first-class cabin of Apex Airlines Flight 412, the way certain things hang, not settling, not dispersing, just remaining, taking up space that could not be untaken. The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, the woman in row 5 did not lower her phone. The businessman in 4B closed his laptop completely and sat back. Rebecca Foss in 1A turned fully around in her seat. The man in 6C, who had been asleep for the past hour, opened his eyes, as if the quality of the silence had been sufficient to wake him. Zara Williams stood in the aisle and did not move, and did not speak, and did not change her expression, and the thing that was happening in her chest, a hot, complicated thing that she had felt before, had been feeling in smaller doses for the past 2 hours, had been feeling in varying intensities. Her whole life, she held it, where she held things in the specific internal place that her mother had shown her by example long before she had any language for it. The place where you keep the things that could break you if you let them move freely. Her phone was in her hand. It had been recording for 2 hours and 16 minutes. It had heard everything. She's been quiet. The entire flight, said a woman's voice from row 5. The passenger who had her phone raised, not loudly, not performatively, just clearly the statement of someone who feels the need to introduce a fact into a space where a lie is being allowed to settle. I've been watching. She hasn't done a single thing. Ryan Holloway emerged from the galley. He was Diane's cousin, a fact that only 3 people on the aircraft knew, none of whom were passengers, and he was also a lead flight attendant, and he came into the aisle with the specific bearing of a man who has been listening from behind a curtain and has now decided that his intervention has become necessary, and he took in the scene with the rapid assessment of someone who has been briefed on a version of it and is now selecting which version to perform. "Ma'am," he said to Zara, and his tone was the tone of professional authority containing what it wanted to present as genuine concern. "There have been a number of disruptions from this row today, and we're going to need you to return to your seat." "I haven't disrupted anything," Zara said, and she looked at Ryan with the same direct, unequivocal, absolutely composed quality that she had maintained for the entirety of this flight. "I've been documenting every interaction since boarding," said Okafor from 4A, and his voice was still quiet, even still carrying the specific weight of someone who has been taking notes on a legal pad and is now choosing to let that be known. Row 3. A has not disrupted anything. Would you like me to read back what I have? Ryan looked at him. From 2B came the voice of Judge Evelyn Cross, and it did not raise itself and it did not hurry itself, and it carried across the first-class cabin with the authority of a woman who had been the final word in a room for 3 decades. "My name is Evelyn Cross. I am a retired federal judge from the 11th Circuit, and I have been sitting in this seat for 2 hours and 11 minutes, and I have witnessed every interaction between your crew and this passenger since we left the gate, and I will testify to every detail of what I have witnessed." She paused. Every detail. Ryan Holloway looked at Judge Cross, and in that moment, in the particular quality of the pause that followed, it was possible to see the exact instant when he understood what the seat assignment 2B had contained for this entire flight and what it meant that he had not known. Behind the galley curtain, Nina Park heard everything. She looked at the manifest, at the Alpha flag, at the name, at the time on her watch. She pulled the 2-page document out of her apron pocket, the one she had printed before boarding the one with the crew memo below the manifest flag. The memo that Diane had written 3 weeks ago, and she folded it very carefully along clean lines, and she held it in her hand, and she waited for the right moment, which she understood was coming. The plane began its descent into Logan International at 9:14 a.m., the nose tilting forward with the particular slow, convincing gravity of altitude surrendering, and Ryan Holloway made a cabin announcement in the practiced, smooth tones of professional crisis management. "Ladies and gentlemen, we want to ensure a smooth arrival. There is a minor passenger situation being assessed. Please remain seated with seatbelts fastened. We appreciate your patience and cooperation." And the announcement was a masterpiece of implication specific enough to communicate that something is happening and vague enough to allow the listener to construct the worst plausible version of what that something was. Several passengers who had not been watching the situation clearly looked at Zara. The narrative had been turned quietly and efficiently, and she had not moved, had not raised her voice, had not given them a single frame of behavior that could be described as the cause of the disruption they were now being told to expect. But she felt the shift in the cabin's atmosphere, the way you feel, a change in barometric pressure through something other than reason, through something that lives in the skin. She took her phone from the tray rest where it had been recording and held it in her lap and composed a text to her mother with the careful, complete concision of someone who has very limited time and needs to transfer maximum information. Apex Airlines. Flight 412 Atlanta to Boston. Seat 3A. Attendants. Diane Holloway and Ryan Holloway related to each other. Meal withheld intercom announcement targeting me blocked from first-class restroom direct racial statement recorded. Authorities called to gate. Recording secured to cloud. ETA Logan 945. She read it once, then sent it. Dr. Nadine Williams, sitting in a DOJ briefing room on the 4th floor of the Robert F. Kennedy Building in Washington, D.C., felt her phone vibrate against the table, picked it up, read the message once, and then stood up and said with the specific quality of quiet authority that made everyone in the room understand immediately that the meeting was over, "I need the room." Her reply to Zara arrived 40 seconds after she sent the text. 3 words. "I see it. Go." Zara read it, locked the phone, and put it back in her bag. In the galley, Diane was on the crew phone, the landline handset pressed close. Her voice low, but not low enough for Nina Park standing 3 feet away and pretending to inventory the beverage cart to miss what was being said. "Uncle Harold, she's got recordings. I don't know what's on them. She's been careful. Her mother. I looked up the passenger profile. Her mother is some kind of attorney. I don't know. It said DOJ. I couldn't get further detail. She's a kid. She's going to Harvard. Yes, I understand. I'll document it. What do you want me to—" A pause. "All right. Yes." Tom Briggs, Chief Operating Officer of Apex Airlines, put down the phone in his office at Apex's Atlanta headquarters and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then he looked at his assistant through the glass partition and said, "Get me the duty legal team, and pull the passenger profile on Williams, Zara, Flight 412, and send it to me." The profile arrived in 90 seconds. He read it in 45. He looked at the Harvard interview. He looked at the age 17th. He looked at the mother's name and employment field Williams Nadine, DOJ. He looked at that for a long time. Then he called Diane back. "Build the counter documentation," he said. "Get statements from passengers who weren't watching. Use the profile. She's got a college interview tomorrow morning. Document the behavior as erratic, emotional, age-related instability, whatever fits. Make sure Ryan's report matches yours." What Briggs did not know, because Diane had not known to tell him, was that the woman in seat 2B was a retired federal judge who had been watching the entire flight with the meticulous, comprehensive attention of someone who understood exactly what she was watching and exactly what it would be needed for. And what neither of them knew was that Nina Park had already printed the manifest and the memo. Diane returned to the cabin with a service tray containing 2 glasses of sparkling water for the forward rows, and as she moved past row 3, she stumbled expertly, almost imperceptibly, with the specific motor control of someone who has rehearsed this kind of accident, and the glass tilted and a full pour of red wine that she had been holding at her side out of the visual line of most passengers came down across the front of Zara's navy blazer and white blouse in a clean, spreading arc, soaking the fabric running down toward the lap. The gasp from the woman in row 5 was audible. Diane's expression arranged itself instantly into devastated apology. "Oh, I'm so terribly sorry, how awful, and on your clothes, what a shame." Zara looked down at the navy blazer, the one she had ironed at 11 p.m. The only blazer she owned, the one that had cost $14 and 8 more to him and 16 months of imagining. And the wine was already past, saving dark and wide across the front. And she held the fabric away from her skin with 2 fingers and looked at it for exactly 1 second. Across the aisle, Judge Cross reached into her bag without a word and withdrew a small bottle of club soda and a clean handkerchief and extended both across the aisle and said nothing, because there was nothing adequate to say, and she understood that. Zara took them. She blotted the fabric methodically, knowing it was already past the point where blotting would help working through the motions anyway, because doing something was better than sitting still with the stain spreading. She folded the handkerchief and set it on the tray, and then she looked at the blazer for a moment, and then she folded it carefully across her lap, inside out, so the stain faced down and turned back to the window. The phone on the tray was still recording. In 4A, Okafor had stopped writing. He looked at his notes at the accumulated documentation of the past 2 hours and 19 minutes, and then he looked at the back of Zara's head and at the way her shoulders were set. Not slumped, not rigid, just level held in place by the kind of effort that looks from the outside like stillness, but from the inside requires something enormous. And he picked up his pen and wrote one final line, 9:18 a.m. wine. Deliberate, interview, clothing destroyed. Then he put the pen in his breast pocket and closed the legal pad. He would need it all in a different place very soon. The wheels of Flight 412 touched down at Logan International Airport at 9:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in March, and through the window of Seat 3, Zara Williams could see parked on the tarmac beside their assigned gate, 2 airport police vehicles with their blue lights cycling in the thin morning light. She looked at them for a moment. Then she looked at the stain on her blazer folded across her lap. Then she looked out the window at the Boston skyline in the distance, the tops of the buildings pale against the overcast sky, and she thought about the address she had memorized, the Harvard admissions office on Byerly Hall, which was a 15-minute taxi ride from Logan under normal circumstances, and she thought about the clean charcoal suit that she did not own, and about the interview notes that were ruined, and about all of it. Everything, the entirety of the last 3 hours, and she breathed in the careful, deliberate way she had learned, and then she gathered her things. "We are directly behind you," Judge Cross said from 2B very quietly without looking up. "Don't answer any questions without representation." "Present," Okafor said from 4. Equally quiet, equally steady. Ryan Holloway appeared at the front of the cabin and asked Zara to remain seated until her row was called, phrased as cabin protocol, which it was not since first-class passengers typically deplaned before economy, and other passengers in the forward rows exchanged glances, and some of them looked at Zara with the particular helpless sympathy of people who understand they are watching something wrong happen and have not yet determined whether they will do anything about it. Diane appeared and escorted Zara off the aircraft first, just the 2 of them ahead of every other passenger, which would have felt like preferential treatment under any other context, but felt under this one exactly like what it was. At the jet bridge, 2 uniformed airport police officers stood with the professional stillness of authority, and a local news camera was visible at the far end of the terminal corridor through the gate windows. Someone had called ahead, and Zara noticed this in the same comprehensive filing way she noticed everything, and understood the shape of what was being constructed. "This is the passenger who has been disruptive during the flight," Diane said to the officers, and her voice had the practiced credibility of a woman who has been performing authority for 20 years. She admitted to making unauthorized recordings of crew members, which may constitute a federal violation, and there have been behavioral incidents throughout the flight that are documented in our crew reports. "That is not accurate," Zara said, and she said it the same way she had said everything that morning, without volume, without heat, with only the clean, undecorated weight of someone stating a fact, and she looked at the officers directly. "I was subjected to discriminatory treatment from the moment I boarded. I have recordings. They have been backed up to cloud storage." The officers exchanged the specific look of people recalculating a situation. "We'll need to sort this out at the security office," the senior officer said. Tom Briggs was waiting at the security office when they arrived, tailored suit. Corporate composure, the practiced affect of a man who manages difficult situations for a living, and he introduced himself with the smooth efficiency of someone who has decided how this meeting is going to go before anyone else in the room has taken their seat. Framing the situation in the first 30 seconds as an internal airline conduct matter, a passenger with behavioral concerns, crew documentation thorough and consistent. Zara sat in the chair across from the officers. She said her name. She said nothing else. She had already confirmed on her phone while walking through the terminal that the recordings had uploaded successfully. The door of the security office opened 6 minutes after Zara sat down, and Judge Evelyn Cross walked in with the quiet, purposeful movement of someone who has entered rooms that did not expect her and reconfigured them by the simple act of being present, and she announced her name and her title and her circuit in the same flat, carrying voice she had used in the cabin, and the senior officer's posture shifted visibly. A small straightening, a recalibration of who the authority in this room was. Behind her came James Okafor, who presented a business card to the officer nearest the door and said his firm's name and his practice area. Civil Rights Litigation, Federal Courts, 15 years, and said that he had been seated 4 rows behind the passenger in question for the duration of the flight and had been documenting incidents since 7:14 a.m. He placed his legal pad on the table. The shift in the room was not dramatic. It was something quieter, the slow molecular redistribution of weight that happens when the assumptions a space was built on turn out to be incorrect. Diane, standing near the window, spoke before the redistribution could complete. She asked the officers in a measured, professionally concerned tone whether they might want to check the passenger's carry-on for potential alcohol, noting that there had been apparent signs of intoxication during the flight. The senior officer unzipped the side pocket of Zara's bag. 2 miniature bottles. Zara looked at them the way you look at something that has been placed in front of you by someone who expected the sight of it to destroy you. Her expression did not change. "Those are not mine," she said. "I have never opened that pocket." Cross moved to the table without urgency. "I occupied the seat directly across the aisle from this passenger for 4 hours and 4 minutes, she said. She consumed in total approximately 4 ounces of water. That is the only thing I watched her drink. I would testify to that in any court in this country." She looked at Diane. "I would also testify to the fact that I watched you reach toward her bag in the aisle during the descent while she was looking at her phone." The silence that followed that statement had a different quality from all the previous silences. Okafor's voice, still entirely even evidence planting, is a criminal matter. "We'd like that documented by this office." The officers were no longer looking at Zara. Both of them were looking at Diane, and the look contained the specific quality of people who have been handed a situation they were told was one thing and is manifestly another. Tom Briggs stepped forward and began the sentence that started with "This is a company matter" and ended somewhere that it could not quite reach, because the momentum had left the sentence before it concluded, and what remained was a man in an expensive suit standing in a room where every surface he had tried to control had just slipped from his hands simultaneously. The door opened. The woman who walked through the door of the airport security office was wearing a charcoal gray suit with a white shirt and no jewelry except a watch, and she held her DOJ credentials open in her right hand, the way a person holds a document they are not asking permission to display. And she did not look at Diane Holloway first, or at Tom Briggs, or at the officers, or at Judge Cross, or at James Okafor. She looked at her daughter. Zara Williams looked back at her mother and did not cry and would not hear. But she exhaled once a single, long, completely controlled breath that was the sound of 14 months of 2 jobs and 11 p.m. ironings and Harvard preparation and 3 hours of recorded discrimination, all at once finding somewhere to go. And it was the only thing in the room that no one who witnessed it would ever entirely forget. "Doctor." Nadine Williams lowered her credentials, looked at the room, and said, "Dr. Nadine Williams, Acting Head Civil Rights Division, United States Department of Justice. I've been monitoring this situation since 9:13 a.m. I have my daughter's text documentation and the complete audio and video files she transmitted to secured cloud storage." She looked at the senior officer. "I'd like a word with my daughter before this proceeds." Briggs had been watching the door open. He had had approximately 4 seconds to recalibrate, and in those 4 seconds he found the professional composure that had served him through 20 years of corporate crisis management and reassembled it. and he said, "Dr. Williams, I understand your concern, but this is an internal airline matter involving documented passenger misconduct, and it involves a federally regulated carrier doctor," Williams said, and her voice had the quality of a sentence that knows it will not need to be repeated, and a pattern of treatment that I believe you are aware of, given that I have the names of 3 prior settlements under NDA involving similar treatment of passengers of color in first class on Apex Airlines routes in the past 4 years. She paused. "Would you like to discuss those here, or would you prefer a different venue?" Tom Briggs was still, the kind of stillness that is not calm. He looked at Brenda at Diane, and she was looking at him, and in the look between them was the entire shared history of people who have made the same decision, many times in professional solidarity, and are now understanding that the decision looks different in this room than it did in every other room where they made it. The senior officer said quietly, "Mr. Briggs, Miss Holloway, I'm going to ask you both to wait outside while we speak with Dr. Williams and her daughter." In the corridor, Nina Park had been standing for 11 minutes with 2 folded pages in her hand, waiting for someone to ask. Judge Cross came into the corridor 2 minutes after Briggs and Diane were asked to step out, moving with the unhurried pace of a woman who had identified the next necessary thing and was going to do it. And Nina Park saw her coming and straightened from where she had been standing against the wall and said, "I have something you need to see." She handed over the 2 printed pages. Cross unfolded them in the corridor under the fluorescent lights and read them with the same thorough, unhurried comprehension she brought to everything. And her expression did not change during the reading, which was the expression of a person who has already suspected the content and is now simply having the suspicion confirmed rather than surprised. The first page, the passenger manifest for Flight 412, Row 3, with the Alpha flag illuminated beside Zara's name, Special Services Alpha Level. "Do not disturb. Contact Williams Foundation Internal Security upon request." The second page, an internal crew memo, dated 3 weeks earlier, distributed from Diane Holloway to Ryan Holloway, and copied to 2 other senior attendants on the Atlanta-Boston route, written in language that was careful enough to avoid any single phrase that would be explicitly illegal and specific enough that no reasonable person reading it could misunderstand its instruction. Premium cabin culture maintenance. Enhanced verification protocols for non-typical profile passengers. Ensure consistency of service standards. The language of bureaucracy deployed in service of exclusion, and at the bottom of the distribution list added in a separate notation, the initials T.B. Tom Briggs. Cross refolded the pages along their original creases. She looked at Nina. "How long have you had this?" "Since before we took off," Nina said. "I printed it when I saw the flag, and Diane blocked me from calling operations. I didn't know what to do with it until now." "You did the right thing," Cross said simply and without embellishment, which was more valuable to Nina in that moment than any more elaborate reassurance would have been. Cross walked back into the security office and placed the 2 pages on the table in front of the officers without performance or preamble and said, "This is the internal crew memo that governed the treatment of this passenger today. Note the distribution. Note the initials at the bottom." The officers looked at the pages. Then they looked at the door through which Tom Briggs had just been asked to step. In the security office, Dr. Williams looked at the memo for a long moment, and then she looked at the Alpha flag notation on the manifest, the flag that would have told any flight attendant who bothered to check it that this passenger was not to be interfered with, and the expression on her face was the expression of a woman who has spent 20 years in civil rights law and still, after 20 years, encounters the specific texture of this thing and feels it land. Zara read the memo over her mother's shoulder. She read the line about non-typical profile passengers. She read the initials T.B. She did not say anything. Diane was brought back into the room. She saw the pages on the table. She saw Nina Park standing in the doorway. She understood in the complete and final way that you understand something, when the last thing that could have prevented it has already happened, that it was over, and the particular quality of the understanding moved across her face like weather, not quickly, not dramatically, but completely leaving the landscape different than it had been before. Zara watched from her chair. She had not spoken since the security office door opened. She didn't need to. The recording had said everything, and now the document had said the rest, and the only thing left was the part where the room arranged itself around what had been documented, which it was now quietly and inexorably doing. 36 hours after Flight 412 landed at Logan International, the story broke in the way that the stories that matter tend to break not from one source and not from one direction, but from many simultaneously, so that the subject of the story cannot face any single point of pressure and call it containable. Priya Solis's piece in the National Observer ran first at 6 a.m. on Thursday morning under the headline, "Airline Crew Memo Shows Pattern of Targeted Treatment for Black Passengers in Premium Cabins." And it was not just Zara's story, though. Zara's story was the center of it. It was 19 stories because Priya had spent the 36 hours after receiving a tip from a source she would not name making calls to former Apex passengers whose discrimination complaints had been settled quietly under non-disclosure agreements, and 11 of them had decided that the existence of Diane's memo made their NDA unenforceable, and 3 more had decided that they didn't care whether it was enforceable. And so the piece contained 19 accounts covering 4 years, all involving passengers of color in first class or business class, all with the same structural shape: the cold greeting, the withheld service, the announcement, the escalation, the settlement, the silence. A pattern built one incident at a time, each one individually invisible, collectively undeniable. At 6:04 a.m., while the Observer piece was still loading on servers across the country, the unedited recording from Zara's phone was released by a coalition of 3 civil rights organizations, 2 hours and 22 minutes of audio and video. The entire flight from boarding to landing, and it was not edited for impact, not trimmed to highlight the worst moments, not accompanied by music or narration, just the plain continuous record of what had happened on Flight 412 on a Tuesday morning in March, and the plain, continuous record was more devastating than any edited version would have been. At the 2:03 mark on the recording, Diane Holloway's voice was heard clearly. "Know your place. People like you don't belong up here." The phrase was isolated by 3 different social media accounts within 40 minutes of release and had been shared 890,000 times by noon. By 2 p.m., hashtag Zara Williams had been used 2.3 million times across platforms. By 4 p.m., hashtag People Like You Air, borrowed directly from Diane's words weaponized back against the airline, had passed it. What happened to the story in those hours was the specific thing that happens when the truth is simple enough to be held in a single sentence, and the evidence is thorough enough to make denial structurally impossible. It spread with the clean, unstoppable momentum of water, finding its own level, moving through every channel simultaneously, and nothing Apex Airlines did in response could get ahead of it, because there was nothing to get ahead of the recording. Was the recording, and the memo was the memo, and neither of them could be argued with. Apex stock opened Thursday morning at $41 and closed at $32. By Friday morning, it was at $28. A teacher in Memphis named Deshauna Powell posted a photo of her Apex boarding pass from 2 years earlier, first class Atlanta to Memphis, alongside 3 sentences: "I thought I imagined it. I thought it was just me. I thought I was being sensitive." Her post received 400,000 likes before nightfall and was shared on every major platform. And beneath it, in the comments, were hundreds of similar accounts, people who had experienced the specific hard-to-name, easy-to-gaslight thing that Zara's recording had now given a name and a sound and a face to. Current Apex employees began posting anonymously that evening, and the posts described not aberrant behavior by a single flight attendant, but a culture so embedded that it had long since stopped feeling like a policy and started feeling like weather. Something that was simply there that you learned to navigate or not, that no one spoke about directly, because everyone understood the language of indirection that had been built to carry it. The Diane Holloway memo was not an outlier. It was one of at least 6. Priya Solis was on the phone to a second source before the first piece had been live for 3 hours. Apex Airlines released its official statement at 9 a.m. Thursday through the corporate communications office, and it was the kind of statement that a company releases when it has calculated that the statement must exist, but has not yet accepted that the calculation must change. Apex Airlines holds itself to the highest standards of passenger care and does not tolerate discrimination in any form. The employees involved in this incident acted outside of company policy and values. Their behavior does not reflect the Apex Airlines culture or the commitment to diversity and inclusion that guides our operations. We are conducting a thorough internal review. The statement described Diane Holloway and Ryan Holloway as individuals who had acted outside company values. It was posted at 9:03 a.m. By 9:41 a.m., 3 former Apex employees had gone on record with Priya Solis, stating that Diane Holloway had been named Apex Airlines Employee of the Year for the Atlanta-Boston route in the same calendar year she wrote the profiling memo, and that the award ceremony had been attended by Tom Briggs, whose initials appeared on the memo's distribution list. The statement was not revised. Apex's PR firm deployed the crisis management infrastructure for what they internally classified as a Tier 2 narrative challenge, 2 sides to every story, let facts emerge, premature judgment, harmful, and seeded the framing across several accounts, with large followings that had existing relationships with the airline's marketing department. The posts went up between 10 and 11 a.m. and were identified by social media researchers within 40 minutes. And by noon, the identification itself had become a story, and the story was worse than the original had been. James Okafor filed the federal civil rights complaint against Apex Airlines' Diane Holloway. Ryan Holloway and Tom Briggs at 10 a.m. Thursday, naming them all as respondents, attaching the recording, attaching his legal pad notes with timestamps, attaching Judge Cross's sworn witness statement, and attaching the 2-page document Nina Park had provided, which was now authenticated and notarized. Congresswoman Adeyeze Harden, chair of the House Transportation Committee, announced formal hearings on discrimination in the airline industry at 2 p.m. Thursday, naming Apex as the subject, but stating explicitly that the committee's examination would not be limited to a single carrier, that the 19 cases in Priya Solis's reporting and the pattern the memo represented indicated something wider than one airline's individual failure. Apex's corporate partners began reviewing their associations with the specific, careful language of organizations that have already made their decision and are now managing the timing of the announcement. 2 travel booking platforms placed advisory notices on Apex flights. A major credit card company announced a review of its Apex Rewards partnership. A hotel chain quietly suspended joint marketing campaigns. The settlement offer arrived at Okafor's office at 4:17 p.m. Thursday via intermediary. 7 figures, full scholarship to any University of Zara's choice, lifetime first-class travel on any Apex route, confidentiality agreement required to be executed within 72 hours. Okafor read it once, made a copy, and filed the original in a folder he labeled Exhibit C, Apex Attempt to Settle before Congressional Record. He called Dr. Williams to inform her it had arrived. "I know," she said. "What do you want to do with it?" "Leave it where it is," she said, "for now." Tom Briggs called twice that afternoon, once to Okafor's office and once to the intermediary who had delivered the settlement, and neither call changed the folder in which Exhibit C was filed. By Thursday evening, Apex's internal communications were being described by sources inside the company as controlled panic, which was a phrase that several of those sources used independently without coordination, which was itself a kind of evidence about the state of the company. On the tarmac outside Logan International, a ground crew member named Wilson took a photo of Gate B9, the gate where Flight 412 had landed, and posted it with the caption, "This is where it started." It had 60,000 shares by midnight. Judge Evelyn Cross drove Zara to Cambridge on Wednesday morning in her daughter's borrowed Honda, taking a route that avoided the main campus entrances, where 2 news vans had been parked since 7 a.m., and she found a side street 3 blocks from the admissions building and parked there and turned off the engine and sat for a moment without speaking. "You don't have to explain anything you don't want to explain," she said eventually. "And you don't have to perform strength. You've already demonstrated it. Today you just have to be the person who wrote that application." Zara had the replacement outfit, a charcoal suit that Dr. Williams had purchased the previous night from a department store near their Boston hotel. Not a perfect fit, not her blazer, but clean and professional and present, and she had reconstructed her interview preparation from memory on the hotel notepad between 9 p.m. and midnight, writing out the key statistics. The names, the outcomes working from the knowledge that she had spent 3 years building the Food Desert Initiative, and the facts of it were not in the papers Diane had ruined, but in her where they had always been. She had slept for 4 hours. She looked when she stepped out of the car like someone who had decided something. Inside the admissions building, an associate director named Angela Way met them in a quiet back hallway, away from the entrance where reporters had gathered, and walked them to a private waiting area, with the specific careful warmth of someone who has been briefed on a situation and has decided how she personally is going to respond to it. And Zara noticed this and appreciated it without saying so, and sat down and opened her notes and read them once more. Professor Marcus Aldridge from the sociology department was in his late 50s, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the unhurried manner of a man who teaches for pleasure rather than obligation. And he shook Zara's hand and said her name correctly on the first attempt, which was something. And then they sat down on opposite sides of a small table, and the interview began. He asked about the Food Desert Initiative. He asked specifically not the origin story, not the emotional narrative, but the mechanics, how she had identified the 11 neighborhoods, how she had structured the nonprofit partnerships, how she had measured outcomes, what had failed in year 2, and what she had changed in response to the failure. He asked follow-up questions that demonstrated he had read her application materials carefully and found genuine points of inquiry in them, and Zara answered with the specificity of someone for whom these were not talking points, but the record of actual work, and the conversation moved with the ease of 2 people who are both genuinely interested in the same thing. Toward the end, he paused and set his pen down and said, "There is something hovering over this conversation that we haven't addressed. I have some awareness of recent events. Is there anything you'd like to say about them in the context of your application?" Zara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I boarded a plane in a first-class seat that I was entitled to. I was treated as though I wasn't. I documented it. Then I came to this interview." She stopped there. Professor Aldridge looked at her for a moment, and in the look was something that was not sympathy and not admiration exactly, but something more precise. The look of a person who has spent a career studying the way that power operates in ordinary spaces and has just been given a text that describes it with unusual economy. "Thank you," he said, and made one final note and closed her file. In the hallway after the interview, Zara walked out of the room and continued walking for about 20 feet. And then she stopped and turned and pressed her back against the wall and closed her eyes and breathed long, slow, thorough, the release of something that had been held for a very long time. And Judge Cross, who had followed at a respectful distance, simply stood nearby and said nothing and let it complete. Then Zara straightened and opened her eyes. "Okay," she said. "Okay," Cross agreed. They walked out together through the side entrance away from the cameras into the cold Boston morning. On Thursday evening, in a 2-bedroom apartment in a suburb of Atlanta, whose walls held 20 years of Apex Airlines service plaques and commendation certificates and the framed Employee of the Year photo from 3 years ago. The one where she was smiling and holding a plaque, and Tom Briggs was standing beside her with his hand on her shoulder, and they were both looking at the camera with the particular satisfaction of a thing going well. Diane Holloway sat at her kitchen table with her service ID badge and her crew insignia pin and her termination letter in front of her, and she did not touch any of them. The termination letter had arrived by email at 2:17 p.m., effective immediately, signed by a senior HR vice president. whose name Diane had seen in internal correspondence for years, but had never spoken to personally, and the language was the language of liability. Management, failure to uphold company values, conduct inconsistent with Apex policies, termination, pending further legal review, and it was the specific quality of impersonal professional language applied to a personal professional catastrophe. And Diane had read it twice and then put it in her printer tray and printed it and set it on the table, because somehow having the paper in front of her felt more honest than the email. Ryan had called 3 times. She had not answered. Tom Briggs had called once early in the afternoon before his own situation had fully declared itself. The call had been 7 minutes long, and she remembered almost nothing of what was said, except the phrase, "We handle this together," and the feeling already forming during the call. That "together" was a word that was going to dissolve very quickly when it became legally inconvenient. She turned the Employee of the Year photo face down on the table. She did not feel wronged. This was the thing that surprised her, sitting with it in the quiet apartment. She did not feel that an injustice had been done to her, which was what she might have expected to feel, which was what she thought she would feel if this day ever came. And for years she had thought it never would, because the thing she had been doing had worked for so long that it had started to feel simply like competence, like professional judgment, like the exercise of experience. She knew the word for it. She had known the word for it the whole time. She had chosen not to apply the word to herself because the word would have required a confrontation with the person she was in those moments. In the moment she said it, in the specific moment when the words, "People like you don't belong up here," came out of her mouth with the ease of something that had been waiting for permission to be said. And that confrontation was now unavoidable because the recording existed, and the recording was a mirror, and the person in the mirror was identifiable. And it was her. She looked at the service plaques on the wall. 20 years. She had been good at the job. She had genuinely been good at it in most of the ways that mattered, in most of the interactions with most of the passengers, and the ones where she hadn't been the ones she had coded as protocol enforcement and cabin culture maintenance, and all the other phrases she had built to contain. The thing she was actually doing. Those ones were now the only ones anyone would remember. Anyone. And that was also something she understood with a clarity that was not comfortable and did not feel like unfairness. Ryan called again. She set the phone face down on the table beside the termination letter. She opened her laptop. She typed Zara's name into the search bar. The results came back immediately. News articles, social media coverage. The recording, a photograph from outside the Harvard admissions building of a young woman in a charcoal suit who looked composed and deliberate and like someone who had already decided what the day was going to be rather than allowing the day to decide for her. Diane looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she opened a blank email. She started typing and deleted it and started again and deleted it again and then sat for a while without typing anything, looking at the cursor blinking in the empty field. And then she typed 4 sentences and read them back and added nothing and took nothing away and moved her finger over the send button and stopped, and then she sent it. She closed the laptop. She looked at the face-down photo on the table. She did not turn it over. The congressional hearing room held 340 people in its gallery and was full for the first time in 14 months. And when Zara Williams walked in through the side door in the navy blazer, the original one cleaned but not fully restored, the ghost of the wine stain still faintly visible at the left cuff, because she had decided without discussing it with anyone that she would wear it exactly as it was. The gallery produced a sound that was not quite applause and not quite silence, but something between them, a collective intake and exhale, that was the sound of a room recognizing something it had been waiting to see. She walked to the witness table and sat down and adjusted the microphone and looked at the panel of 14 representatives without visible anxiety and with the complete settled attention of someone who has been preparing for this moment for 18 days and is now simply here for it. Congresswoman Adese Hardin chairing direct with the energy of someone who had been wanting to hold this particular hearing for considerably longer than the past 18 days. thanked Zara for coming and asked her to share her experience in her own words. Zara spoke for 18 minutes without notes. She started at the boarding door. She described Diane's expression. She described the boarding pass examination. She described the water and the papers. She described the meal service and the gap between the seats where she could see the chicken that she had been told was unavailable. She described the announcement. She described the walk to the restroom and the 2 words that ended it. She described the wine. She said each of these things in the order they happened, with specific times when she had them and general sequence when she didn't, and her voice was level throughout and did not perform emotion and did not withhold it. She simply described in language that was entirely accessible and entirely precise the experience of being a 17-year-old girl sitting in a seat she had paid for and being told in 100 different languages before the words themselves arrived that the seat did not belong to her. When she played the recording for the committee, the audio isolated to the lavatory moment, Diane's voice clear and unhesitating. 2 representatives visibly winced, and one looked away briefly and then looked back. Congresswoman Hardin asked, "What would you like to see come from this?" Zara thought for a moment that was not a performance of thinking but actual thinking. Every passenger, she said, regardless of what they look like, should be able to use the restroom they paid for. The gallery laughed, not unkindly, but with the specific laughter that comes when a simple truth is delivered in such plain language that the absurdity of the situation it describes becomes suddenly fully visible, and the laughter built for a moment, and then softened into something warmer, and one representative was smiling in a way she didn't bother to suppress. Hardin didn't suppress her smile either. Apex's legal team raised a procedural objection. Hardin cut them off before the sentence finished. In the gallery, Dr. Nadine Williams watched her daughter at the witness table, and her expression was not the expression of a proud mother performing pride for cameras. It was the expression of a woman watching someone she has loved for 17 years become something she always suspected was there, and recognizing the specific quality of that becoming and being very still with the weight of it. She did not look away once. Tom Briggs had announced his resignation as COO of Apex Airlines at 8:47 a.m. before the hearing opened through a statement released by his personal attorney that described a desire to spend more time with family and acknowledged that the current environment at Apex required new leadership language that satisfied no one and was immediately and comprehensively disbelieved by everyone who read it, which was everyone but which created the paper record of a departure that had been negotiated rather than forced, a distinction that mattered in the legal proceedings to follow. The internal memo, with his initials, entered the congressional record at 10:23 a.m. Diane Holloway and Ryan Holloway faced federal civil rights charges, evidence planting in a formal security proceeding, and in Ryan's case, an additional charge related to the filing of a false incident report charges that Okafor's firm had been building documentation for since the boarding pass inspection at 7:14 a.m., and that the 14 pages of legal pad notes, Judge Cross's notarized statement, Nina Park's testimony, and the 2-hour and 22-minute recording made structurally difficult to contest. Nina Park was offered and accepted whistleblower protection. She subsequently submitted a full statement to the Department of Transportation's Inspector General's office, and the statement described not just Flight 412, but 4 separate prior instances over 7 months in which she had witnessed service disparities on the Atlanta-Boston route and been discouraged from reporting them by senior crew, and the statement named names, and the names were not only Diane's. The Department of Transportation launched a formal compliance review of Apex Airlines 2 days after the hearing, with a scope that had been expanded by congressional request to include 3 other major domestic carriers, named in Priya Solis's follow-up reporting smaller echoes of the same pattern, coded differently, producing the same result. A federal judge issued an interim order within 30 days requiring all domestic carriers to establish and publicly document anti-discrimination protocols for premium cabin service subject to independent audit with penalties for non-compliance that were specific enough to function as actual deterrents rather than the decorative kind. Okafor's office received 43 new inquiries in the week following the hearing. 11 of them had recordings. The settlement Apex eventually offered was different from Exhibit C, no confidentiality requirement, no ND. The figure restructured so that the majority of it funded a passenger rights advocacy program rather than flowing to the Williams family directly because this had been Dr. Williams's counter condition and Apex had at this point very little leverage to negotiate with. One of the terms listed in the agreement on page 4, paragraph 2 was that Apex Airlines would fund an annual anti-bias training program for premium cabin crew across all routes, not named after anyone, not branded as an Apex initiative, just called The Standard, and that the curriculum would be developed with independent civil rights oversight and would be reviewed annually. It was a small thing in a large document. Zara read it 3 times when Okafor sent her the final draft. Then she signed the page and sent it back. The acceptance letter from Harvard arrived on a Tuesday morning in April, and Zara read it sitting at the same desk with the same desk lamp, and when she finished, she folded it carefully along its original crease and slid it back into the envelope and picked up her phone and called her mother. Doctor. Nadine Williams was in a meeting when the call came through, and she excused herself and stepped into the hallway and answered, and Zara said simply, "I got in." There was a silence on the line that was not empty. It was full, dense with everything it contained. The 2 jobs, and the 14 months, and the ironed blazer, and the ruined papers, and the wine, and the security office, and the hearing room, and the charcoal suit, and all of it. Every piece of it. And then her mother said very quietly, "I know." And neither of them spoke for a while after that, and it was one of the best silences either of them had ever been part of. 3 weeks after the acceptance letter, an email arrived in Zara's inbox from an address she didn't recognize, dollaway.personal@gmail, and it contained 4 sentences I knew exactly what I was doing. I told myself it was something else for a long time, but I knew. I'm sorry it took this long to say it plainly. I hope your interview went well. Zara read it twice, and then she closed the email, and she did not reply, and she did not delete it, and it remained in her inbox neither answered nor discarded, which felt like the most honest response available. On the first day of classes, she walked across Harvard Yard with her backpack on one shoulder and looked at the old brick buildings and the September light coming through the trees, and she thought about the teacher in Memphis who had posted her boarding pass. She thought about the 43 people who had called Okafor's office. She thought about Nina Park, who had typed a note into her phone at 7:19 a.m. on a Tuesday in March and waited for the right moment to hand it to the right person. She thought about all the phones still in pockets, all the records not yet made, all the moments happening right now in cabins and lobbies and offices and waiting rooms that no one was documenting. And she felt something that was not quite urgency and not quite hope, but lived in the same neighborhood as both a clear, specific, forward-facing thing that she had felt before and recognized now as the feeling of having somewhere to go and knowing why you're going there. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe to our channel for more stories about people who refused to be silent. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you've ever been in a room that told you that you didn't belong there, you know what to do.